question or comment, if you have one into the record. We'll try to monitor, always try to monitor for the folks that are remote, so we make sure we can address all their questions and comments as well. I think we can proceed to roll call.
And I have started recording.
Very good.
All right. Mr. Clauda,
Present.
Ms. Hall,
Present.
Mr. Flynn,
Here.
Ms. Brawley,
Here.
Ms. Hobson,
Here.
Ms. Reese,
Here.
Mr. Tamani,
Here.
and Ms. Warfield. And I don't think I received anything from her.
Okay.
So, okay.
Okay.
You have a quorum.
Very good, very good. I wanted, if everyone's had a chance to take a look at the agenda, in addition to our standing reports, we're also going to be talking about the base student allocation today. And so one thing that's a little funny is we normally get a school district report from Andy and from Ms. Lessons, but which I assume will today, but their knowledge is also important to our main discussion. So I think, I don't know if you've been prepped to stay throughout the meeting, but I think for that discussion part, we definitely will want your input. So with that all said, I'll take a motion to approve the agenda. If there's any changes that anyone wants to propose.
Let's see. I'll move to approve. And it's Dan, I'll second.
Okay, moved and seconded. Any opposition? Then the agenda is approved. First up, chair's report. I don't have one to offer, per se, other than that Carolyn and I did speak with the Budget and Finance Committee of the whole and give our update, and it was my first time giving the update, as chair again since the last time I was chair a couple of years ago. Nothing major to report there other than just that we've been giving them a bit of an introduction to what we've been doing. And I did also mention to them that to the assembly members that we still have a couple of vacant seats. Do we have 3 vacant seats?
Yes.
I think, and so it would be good to get those filled because we're always kind of sweating a quorum bit. Otherwise, for our assembly report, Austin Quinn Davidson was going to give it today, but she has to, she sent a note saying that she wouldn't be able to do that until 11:45 actually, because she's going to be in transit. I think she's got a pretty tightly scheduled day. So we may need to come back to her as far as our assembly report goes. Is there anything?
No, I got the same email as that she'll either call in or be up in person, but I think that they have a work session scheduled to start at noon.
Right.
So.
Right. Okay.
So one, I guess, I don't know if it needs a motion. We could reorder the agenda to do the OMB report and then maybe the department assignments and then come back to assembly and then put the school district things together. Sorry, I didn't think to.
Yeah, I didn't
During our
think
agenda approval,
to do it either until I started talking.
but,
We could do a motion to
I can make that. So I'll move to change the order of the day to move OMB report before assembly report. And then department assignments, also before assembly report.
okay,
Just 'cause I think that'll be quick and then.
I second.
okay, moved and seconded. Any discussion? Okay, then I think we can reorder the agenda in the manner that Anna proposes. Thank you. So we will proceed, so we can proceed then with our OMB updates.
Mine is going to be quick, because we are still closing our 2022 books. So the finance department is still working through our 2022 financial close. They have hired in some consultants to help and assist in that manner, because they are short-staffed down there right now. And so we are hoping to stay on our schedule. It will not affect the 2023 revised budget process that OMB goes through in setting the mill rates for property taxes. So we're still on schedule for that. We don't intend for there to be any change in that schedule. We will be submitting the 2023 revised budget to the assembly the first meeting of April. I believe it is April 11th. So we don't have a budget to actuals for the ending year of 2022, and then for 2023, we are in the middle of the revised budget process. And going through and updating the assessed values. The assessor goes through with all the exemptions, calculates the new assessed values. We use the finalized CPI numbers and the population numbers to include in our property tax calculation that goes into our tax cap limitation calculation. So all of that is just pieces into that. And so we will have that probably for maybe not our April meeting, but our May meeting. But unfortunately, the way the timing is that it will be approved by May. So the assembly has it for 2 meetings. The first meeting, they have it for introduction. And then the second meeting in April is the passage and approval and any amendments that they have. So.
Questions from Ms. Peterson? I have one. Oh, sorry, do you need?
It won't connect to anything. It won't connect to the camera. It won't connect to the speakers or anything. We're actually using my laptop. Thank you.
So with for the revisions, for the Q1 revisions, are there any big items of interest that you expect to see in that? I know it's being developed still.
Yeah, it is still being developed. You know, part of it is what the tax cap calculation does and the balancing of the revenues. So Treasury comes back with new updated revenues based on how 2022 finished to see if their projections for those revenues are still on target, or if we need to adjust those any. Target, or if we need to adjust any.
Nice.
Progress.
For those online, can you hear us now?
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
Yeah, they hear it through the laptop. Perfect. I don't think so. It's on here, so it should be good. Okay. Sorry, we're sorry, we're still working through the technical difficulties. So the big ticket items that, that we're keeping an eye on, obviously that everyone is aware of is the snow plowing and hauling. Yeah, a lot of that happened in 2022. And so right now we're just looking at what they're doing for this spring and the hauling. They do have some hauling that they want to do based on the breakup and drainage in some of the cul-de-sacs and those areas. Also in certain areas where they need to start the street sweeping, because that's another important summer activity that they need to get done sooner rather than later. And so they have some strategic hauling that they still want to do for this year. So that's one of the items that we're looking at as we go through the first quarter revised process, is just where they are right now, and then making sure we have enough for the start of winter next year in October, November, December.
Other questions for Ms. Peterson? Okay,
All right.
don't hear anything else then.
Okay.
Then our next item is the BAC member reports for the department assignments. So does anybody have any updates on their department assignments? Yes, Carolyn.
I met with the real estate departments last month. I met with Lance Wilbur, Director of Community Development, and Tiffany Briggs with Real Estate Services, and learned a lot about the real estate department and on the whole. The real estate department is basically broken up into two sub-departments. One is the Heritage Land Bank, the other is Real Estate Services. With HLB, it's all about uncommitted land such as wetlands and, potential future plans for land that is unallocated for. It has an advisory commission, an annual plan, and a 5-year program. And it also includes state entitlements where the state essentially, which was interesting to me, owes us land. We also talked about the North Anchorage Land Agreement, or NALA, which is an agreement between, I believe, the municipality, Eklutna, and J-Bear. And learned about the real estate transactions, how they have to be appraised and sold at fair market value. That there's a lot of HLB, or most of HLB is actually situated in Girdwood. For Tiffany's side of the department, Real Estate Services, she takes care of acquisitions, disposals, and leases. Everything flows through, every real estate trading transaction flows through her. She's kind of like the city's real estate agent. So a lot of it is transactional. There's foreclosures. She's kind of like a property manager as well. Yeah, there was a lot that was discussed. It was really, really thick. And I was kind of so engrossed in the content. I was not very good at taking notes. It was a lot to digest, but I really appreciated their time and availability and their patience as they explained everything to me in very simple terms, which was appreciated. Yeah.
Thank you, Carolyn.
And I will note that Assemblymember Quinn Davidson has joined us.
Okay.
Hi, good
Do we
morning,
have,
everyone.
morning, Austin. Let me see, are there other, just a second, we'll come right back to you if we can, Austin. Do we have other departmental assignment updates from anyone, including folks online? Don't think we do. So in that case, Ms. Quinn Davidson, do you want to share an assembly update with us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And just for others, I let Nolan and Carolyn and Courtney know, but I'm driving at the moment to a work session. I had something till 11:45, so I'm sorry if there's any background noise, but hopefully it won't be too bad. Just a quick update, and then thought if you guys had any questions or wanted to have a discussion, that would be great too. The work session that we're holding at noon is around a supplemental budget appropriation that Meg Salatel and I are bringing. It's a public safety appropriation, so some money for APD for training, including anti-bias training, but that they did last year, but also some other training that the department needs. We got a grant. I'm sure you guys heard about it, but Courtney could fill us in on the details too, but I think, I can't remember the amount, but it essentially allows us for 3 years to have, I think, 18 more fire department employees, which will be great for the department. After that, we'll have to find out how we're going to fund those new employees. But because we have all these new folks that we need to train, we need to have another academy this year. So that appropriation we're going to discuss at noon would also include $400,000 for additional academy. And I didn't mention the number, but $400,000 for the AP training. And finally, as we've seen, we probably need more money for snow plowing. You know, the season is sort of ending at this point. Well, we'll see, hopefully. But of course, November and December are part of the fiscal year as well. So we were hoping to appropriate $200,000 just to give Paul Van Lanningham, the director of that department, a little buffer room to work if we get additional snow, but also for this fall. And those numbers are just estimates. What we're working with is when we did the FY23 budget, we came in about $1.2 million under the tax cap. So this is about $1 million of additional funds that we know that we have. So we thought, why wait until first quarter budget revisions? We know that this money is available, and we know that these are all needs of the community. So we're bringing that forward, and we'll discuss it today. And I've been in touch with Kent Colhayes, the acting mini manager, and he's going to have the chiefs there and also Lance Wilbur to talk about snow plowing. And I think these are all things that the departments would probably want to include in their typical 1Q request. But we thought, since we know where we are on not fund balance, on a room below the tax cap right now, we might as well go ahead and move forward so that they can get these items going. So I guess that's the big update for right now. We're approaching 1Q, of course, and I don't know if Courtney talked about that yet in the timeline for that, but she probably has the dates for everything. And we'll vote on that on the 25th, which will be my last meeting. And otherwise, we're making great progress. Nolan and Carolyn were at the last Budget and Finance Committee meeting, so they probably could report as well that we're making really great progress on FEMA reimbursement. It just takes a while, but all in all, pretty good. We're waiting for numbers for fund balance. I think particularly given the high vacancy rate in the municipality right now, we probably have quite a bit of leftover money from FY22. And Courtney could speak to the timing of that as well, but I think that we won't have, well, Courtney, actually, maybe you could just speak to when we'll have those numbers, because that would be a good opportunity to fund one-time costs, you know, like the training actually that we're doing at APD. Anyway, Courtney, did you want to add anything?
I don't think so. I did, yep, I did touch on the revised budget process, and I believe that Grant was giving a presentation, so if people are interested in reviewing the 2022 year-end process, Grant Utrinka, our CFO, is actually giving a presentation to the audit committee today. And he was gonna go over their preliminary fund balance.
Oh, great. Courtney, would you mind sending that to me and Meg and Desiree too? And we'll take a look at it, and then maybe we should distribute it to members as well, because they'll probably be curious. So actually, you could send it to all of us if that works.
Did you catch all of that?
Yeah, I think that Grant's presentation is at the audit committee meeting today. I think he might be finishing up. I think it was this morning.
Okay.
But so I'll let him know to send the presentation to everybody, just in case members weren't able to attend that audit committee meeting.
That would be awesome.
Okay. Yep.
Maybe to the BAC members.
Yep,
It's
and
not, I
can,
don't, audit is only if it's not a full participation committee. I can't remember who's on it, but it's not all of us, so. that would be-
Oh, okay. I was
Yeah.
thinking it was a committee of the whole. Okay.
But
I
there-
will have
got the right term.
Grant.
Yeah, it's not.
Okay, I will have Grant send it to everybody so that everybody has that presentation.
Great. Thank you so much.
And Austin, we are having a little bit of technical issues going on, so we have we're all talking to a laptop right now. So but I am gonna ask the groups. Does anyone have questions for the assembly?
I have one.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Anna. I was just wondering if there was an update, or I guess what is the status of the proposed settlement for the Hickle piece. I don't know if that was discussed at Tuesday's meeting or if that's just still TBD.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think it's a little TBD. Kent Colhase wrote us on behalf of the administration and said they were intending to settle that item. I think the number was about 2.5 million, and their interpretation, despite the assembly having passed legislation saying that they cannot settle without our approval, their interpretation is that because there was sort of vague approval for project, that they could use the money within that approval to settle a claim. The assembly doesn't believe that's the case and sent a response letter, and then the administration responded again. So I don't think that there's been a follow-up or discussion. I imagine there'll probably be a work session sometime soon to talk through that. I think the assembly will want to know, if the mayor is settling $2.5 million, what the accounting for that, sort of how we got there, and make sure that it's a fiscally sound decision.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions, Assembly?
None.
Okay, let's see,
Nolan, oh,
Yes.
sorry, did someone else
Go
have a
ahead.
question?
no, go ahead.
One thing I was thinking of that might be of interest, particularly looks like several folks, I didn't even know who was on the BAC right now, but looks like several folks who are in the middle of campaigning. And so this might be of interest to you. Just an update on the port. So Pete and Suzanne and Kevin and I all went down to Juneau to advocate for a number of things that were in our legislative program. It was a joint program adopted by the mayor and adopted by us as well. And in that included a $20 million request for homelessness. We wanted to try to get it a little more specific because I think they're less likely to just give us $20 million for whatever we want to spend it on, and more likely if we can make an argument around a certain facility or a certain need. I think a lot of us are starting to gravitate around the Project Rec Center, which would provide shelter space and property to build permanent homes. And so anyway, that's one piece. The second piece is the port. And Senator Murkowski was actually down there while we were there and had given her address to the state legislature. And something she brought up, and then that we heard from legislators over and over again, was that the design commission, I believe, I'm forgetting, maybe Courtney knows, maybe which commission it was, but put forward an additional or a new design around a piece of the port that would increase the cost. They estimated, and I think it's still an estimate, by around $200 million. The assembly hasn't engaged in that at all. Nothing's come before us. We haven't voted on it. We don't know the full proposal. So I don't have much to say about what I think about it, but I will share that, and I think the administration supports it, but I'm actually not sure. So if that's wrong, please correct me, Courtney, if you know. But I will say that Senator Murkowski, along with pretty much every legislator, both sides of the aisle that we talked with, was very, I would say upset. I don't know, I don't want to exaggerate, but Senator Murkowski stopped us in the hallway. It's like, what in the heck is going on here? I think people are just tired of the port costing so much money. And in a lot of ways, it needs to cost a lot of money. Like, this is a huge project. It has huge import across Alaska. But we also need to make sure we're being really wise with the muni's expense, with the money that we're raising, and not take for granted federal grants. So I don't know where that process will go, but that's just something worth noting, that there's a lot of conversation around what makes sense, what's the best design, trying not to change things midstream. And we certainly don't want to upset funders. I think that this new proposal is coming before the assembly in the next couple months. I don't know if it will be when I'm there or when new folks are there. But just a heads up, because that's kind of interest, I think, across different levels of government right now.
Austin, is the issue that Senator Murkowski had and that several legislators had about the port, it's about the use of match funds to match the federal, right? And the state not providing that full match, or what exactly is the issue?
Not necessarily. So there was a preliminary design that we've had for a little while. And then recently, and again, I'm forgetting the name of the commission, the Port Modernization Commission, I can't remember, proposed a different design. And so along with that different proposal, which I think they just proposed it to the administration, and my understanding is the administration said they supported it. And then the ADN did an article about it. But when asked what the additional cost would be, I believe the port director estimated around 200 million, but they were still in the process of determining what that additional cost would be. And so the assembly hasn't seen it. We don't really know the details, but when we were there, people very strongly voiced, are you kidding me? It's already hard enough to get money for the port. Why would you add additional design features that would increase the cost by $200 million? So it wasn't necessarily about matching funds, but more about overall cost. And I think there was some comment made, again, I can't quite remember, you guys could read the article in the ADN, but maybe by the port director of like, oh, we'll be seeking federal funds for that and that additional cost. And that's what really set Senator Murkowski off, because I think, she's really tried hard to advocate for the port, but has also been sort of hesitant to spend too much money on the port and been a little critical, I think fairly, just about plans over the years and where we are. And yeah, so that was the issue that I was speaking to. I will say, since you just asked about matching funds and you asked about the state, that we did hear that there was some move or interest at the Senate Finance Committee to perhaps pull back some of the funding that was awarded to the port last year, but has not yet been spent, which would be extremely disappointing. And as I understand it, also quite rare. So Kelly Merrick is on that committee, and she assured us that she would be advocating to keep that funding for the port.
Thank you, Austin. Does anyone else have questions for Austin about anything that's on the assembly? Then I think we can move on. Thanks for making the time to connect with us, Austin. We appreciate it. I know your schedule sounded hectic today.
Yeah, nice to talk with you guys, and hopefully I'll see you next time in person.
Thank you.
If you meet in person, I don't even know. Okay, talk to you later. Bye.
Bye. Okay, then our next item and these is the school district report. And I think we can kind of blend the school district report into our discussion today. So I'm going to hand things over then to Mr. Ratliff and Ms. Lessons.
I'll defer to Ms. Lessons to go ahead and kick us off.
Oh, and I do really quickly, I do want to acknowledge that Carmela Warfield joined us for the record. So thanks for being here, Carmela. Go ahead, Andy.
I'll allow
Okay.
Ms. Lessons to go ahead and give an update first.
Oh, yep. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, thanks all. I'll kind of share what I've been sharing with community councils recently. Let's see, this isn't last night, 2 nights ago, ASD adopted a new English language arts curriculum for our K-3 students. And from a financial standpoint, I think this is both strategic and quite frankly, quite lucky. We're doing so to align with the intent of the Alaska Reads Act and take advantage of $3.8 million in one-time funding from the Department of Education to implement an evidence-based curriculum that'll be supported by the state. And we learned during the process that the current curriculum is actually going to be discontinued. And to that end, ASD would have been on the hook for replacing the curriculum in another year. So I think this is great news from a pedagogical standpoint and from a financial standpoint as well. Yesterday in the finance meeting that we held that I chaired, I did invite some researchers from ICER who are working on a really large meta study of teacher retention in Alaska. They will be presenting more of their findings, I think, around May. But we had a nice conversation about their project, which looks a lot at working conditions in rural and urban sites, and specifically at STEM teachers, because that's where their funding is coming from. But I think that they will have some insights that will help us think about teacher retention effectively for all of our teachers. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from them. Other financial news, we did pass the FY24 budget at our second meeting in February. It's currently with the Assembly right now. And I think in essence, it's really important to understand that the scale of the structural deficit is so big that even $65 million in one-time funds combined from, so that 65 million is 20 million of the last of our federal relief funds. We've used those federal funds for 4 fiscal years to balance our budget. There was $16 million from the state in one-time funds that we saved from FY23 for this very rainy FY24 day. And we used about $29 million of our fund balance, which is as sizable as it is because our vacancies are roughly triple what they would be in a normal year. So we're not paying the salaries and benefits. And so that fund balance has grown larger, but we will be spending down to the board minimum. But even with $65 million in one-time funds, we still are closing the gap by increasing our pupil-teacher ratio by 1. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it really translates to 62 teachers who will not be replaced if they retire and or will be involuntarily displaced, moved from one school to another. And we certainly heard from a couple of our schools at our meeting earlier this week about what does that mean if you pull a kindergarten teacher from the Montessori program? What does it mean if we pull a student from Save High School, which works to improve our credit recovery for high school students? So, you know, students are the ones who are feeling this budget crisis because they are losing the teachers that they need from kindergarten to calculus. That said, I'm encouraged that yesterday, the Senate Education Committee heard SB 52, an amended version, and changes to that bill include when it was introduced originally, it increased the BSA by $1,000. This amended version holds that $1,000 for FY24 and adds an additional $348 in FY25. And then it requires DEED to use the CPI index to calculate an inflation adjustment percentage increase to the BSA in FY26. And I think as we look forward and consider the magnitude of ASD's deficit, I was just looking at that and I have to toggle my screen. Essentially, you know, our structural deficit without action from Juneau grows and grows over the next 3, well, it just keeps growing to the point that for FY27, ASD would need to cull about 1,200 jobs. And this is all in the budget book. But I think that next year's budget, I'm sorry, the FY25 budget deficit currently is projected at about $85 million. And it only goes up from there. So I was really encouraged that both that at a joint assembly board meeting, board members and assembly members came together to support a bill that was presented on the House side, HB 65, which would increase the BSA by $1,250, which is pretty closely aligned with the amount ASD has calculated it needs for FY24, which is $1,268. But I'm thinking at this point that letters of support for SB 52 from all interested parties who care about the kinds of education that our students are able to receive, the ASD is able to deliver. Class sizes, Ignite and gifted education. We talked about swimming and extracurriculars, music, the language programs. There are so many things that people value. And as we've learned throughout the fall, everything has a cost. So I'll pause there. So I'm enthusiastic, but I know that we will need to really continue to express our support to our legislators.
Thank you, Ms. Lessons. Does anyone have questions for school board? Well, that was a very, very, very thorough and sobering update. So I appreciate that very much. I am curious the progress of the House bill and the Senate bill. I've been following those a little bit, and I'm kind of surprised at how slowly they've been moving. I think the House one I saw got its first hearing like 2 days ago. So is that your observation?
Yes, I think that the Senate Education Committee really led the charge from the outset. And it seemed like there was a strategic, this is my opinion, fact gathering mission. There were a number of hearings from different stakeholders. ICER was involved, and they showed how when you adjust for the cost of living, funding in Alaska is 7% below the national average. They had a number of other experts. They invited testimony from school boards across the state, different stakeholders, and everybody's telling the same story. I think that on the House side, they took an initially a little bit more. I mean, everything is bold. $1,000 BSA increase hasn't been explored ever, to my knowledge. But on the House side, Representative Ortez and a number of other co-sponsors said, okay, we're gonna, this is what we think needs to happen at a statewide level. And I think that the amendment, actually, there are a couple of other parts of the amended SB 52. There's been a lot of talk about accountability, and I think that the amended version tries to respond to that interest because it also requires DEED to create a public website to report annual progress towards academic performance by all Alaska students, schools, and districts. And it also directs the Department of Labor and Workforce Development to collaborate with DEED to gather data on career, post-secondary education, and residency data for each graduating student. So I think that's really interesting. And quite frankly, I also think that it's great that it doesn't put the onus on districts to gather and present that data. ASD does have a very transparent data dashboard. You can see the proficiency progress, students' proficiency progress towards our board's goals. You can track graduation rates already, but we also have, a pretty strong IT department and the resources to make that data available. And I think some of the smaller districts in Alaska would really struggle to produce something similar on much more limited budgets. So I like that SB 52 as amended really requires DEED to do that, create something like a data dashboard for the state. That's my own personal opinion, 24 hours after this piece came out.
Thank you. Thank you. Questions or can we move on to Andy? I think it's all you.
Yep, and we've got a presentation. This will be the presentation that we gave to the joint school board assembly meeting. I'll wait a second.
We're gonna do a little dual screen here, so you guys can see it here, but also those online will be able to see it.
I'll think that.
I think that happened.
Okay, for folks online, we're making a few new adjustments.
All right, I think we're ready.
Okay. Scroll down the first slide. This is our calendar. We always generally provide a budget development calendar. As Ms. Lesson said, the school board approved the budget at the February 21st meeting. It'll be at the assembly on, I think it's March 21st is the meeting for the public hearing and approval. The presentation really is going to focus on what the assembly is supposed to approve, which is our upper limit spending authority and our tax request. We will get into a little bit of the details of some of the changes we made within our budget, but when we presented this to the assembly, it wasn't really focused so much on that as it was on the financial package that they're slated to approve. So the next slide. We've shown this chart before. We did update this to include the CPI from FY 22, but it really shows the blue bars at the bottom are what the base student allocation has been since 2017. As you can see, $30 increase in FY 24, and that's the only change. The other bars are either fund balance, state one-time funds, or in recent years, those big changes or the big gold bars are the use of our stimulus money to help shore up our budget. But as we talk about the $1,268
Excuse me, sir. May I interrupt you?
1 second.
The folks online can't see the slides. They're not coming up online for us. I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a message in the chat and I can't see it on my end either.
Okay, let me see. Can you see it now?
No, I can't. We can see it now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So again, this slide was just really to show what the BSA would have been since 2017, which is the last time it had any sort of significant adjustment to it. Really just kind of go back on that point of that flat funding really has eaten into our ability to fund education. The next slide, this is one of the things that the Assembly will approve, and this is our upper limit spending request. About $905 million, and it's about $55 million above what the request for FY 23. Most of that's going to be tied to that capital projects fund line, which is a result of receiving that school bond debt reimbursement money and the board allocating that to specific security projects. So just getting that spending authority for money that we've already received but plan to spend in the next fiscal year. The bigger things there, although you'll see an increase in our general fund of about $49 million, which is mostly just shifting expenditures from the grant that was previously funded by federal stimulus money into our general fund and using our fund balance to help shore that up. So you'll see a somewhat corresponding line item, about $45 million reduction in the grants fund. A couple other notes on there, that project carryover, that's always kind of an interesting one, but that's more of a budgeting and transparency function where this is money that we set aside for like maintenance, IT, charter school carryover, whatever they have. At the end of FY 23, it's just kind of a projection of how much of this unspent money from 23 is going to roll to 24. So we have that upper limit authority to spend those funds that are carried forward. So this budget, it does address our general fund deficit. As Ms. Lesson said, we use about $65 million in one-time funding between the $45 million in fund balance and about $20 million remaining in our federal stimulus money. And then the big structural change being an increase of +1 at all grade levels. So as we increase that class size, just fewer staff for this about the same amount of students. We did scale back some of our projects that were funded by that federal stimulus money, such as like the ASD virtual instructional program. We scaled back some of the IT costs, some of the mental health money that had been dedicated. So really just trying to get this budget to balance was a challenge without trying to make any huge structural changes to it, without knowing how much money we're going to get. The other things is we have 2 school closures in here. One of them is Abbott Luke, which is scheduled to be closed permanently. And the other is Ursa Major, which had structural deficiencies that we found out about over the summer and ended up closing for this school year. Until we can get an engineer's report and see how much that's going to cost to repair, that school will be offline for next year as well. This slide focuses on our general fund revenue. At the top, you'll see circled is an increase of about $8.6 million in the tax request for property taxes, and the $45 million we discussed in fund balance. And we'll spend a little more time on that tax request as we go through there, as we start talking about how that is calculated and what goes into that. But by and large, that's about $7.8 million that is based on the required local contribution that is tied to our property tax values. So as our property goes up, which is, it's based on, this number is actually based on that 2022 calendar year property values. So as you saw, recall, the assessed values went up by about 10% on residential, and I think something lower on business. So that's kind of flowing through to how much the state says the city has to pay. So as we increase that required local contribution by 7.8 million, the state takes that money away from us. So that's really kind of a zero-sum game, but there's always the question of why the taxes keep increasing, but you keep needing more money. But we'll get into that a little bit longer or a little bit later. The state revenue is actually decreasing by 3.9 million, predominantly because of that $7.8 million shift from local to, or from state funding to local funding. We're also having about a $4.8 million reduction on our regular ADM, predominantly because we lost this hold harmless provision when we triggered it in 21, when we lost about 10-11% of our students didn't come back after the pandemic. So the hold harmless provision really just gives us an adjustment in funding to allow us to step down that loss in enrollment for the next 3 fiscal years. So we had that in FY21, it was 75% of our enrollment loss. As compared to FY20. In FY22, it was 50% of our enrollment loss compared to FY20. And then for 23, it was 25% of our enrollment loss. And then it phases out completely next year. So we see a loss of state funding based on that hold harmless provision going away. And the reduction in the local contribution. Yes.
Have you seen a corresponding, like, students returning to the district since that time?
We've been increasing steadily. So we I think reduced down to about, I want to say around 41,000 or so at the onset of the pandemic. And this year we're up to about 44,000.
So is there an offset?
There is. So you do have some gains based on the number of students coming back. We've seen a lot of those come back in our correspondence program. So about $2.3 million increase in money for correspondence is included in here. And about 4.32 million or so in intensive needs funding. So the students that have the more severe disabilities where they need extra help, the state funds those on an individual basis. So we anticipate having, we went up from, I think, 1,016 last year to 1,063 this year, and we're projecting another 10 next year. So we are seeing an increase in the number of students with those more intensive disabilities coming in that need served. And the $30 BSA increase, that makes up about $2.2 million increase in state funding. But all those rolled up together is about $3.9 million loss in state funding. And then we project to have 700,000 or so reduction in federal impact aid, which is the federal payments for students predominantly living on base or other non-taxable lands or otherwise federally connected. And that's just due to fewer students living on base altogether. So as that enrollment declines, so does our revenue for the federal impact aid. Pupil transportation, we also request property taxes through our pupil transportation fund. We've done this for the last probably 3 or 4 years. We haven't seen an increase in funding in pupil transportation since kids walked in the door in 2015. So 15-16 was the last update. As you're probably all aware, we did have some rolling closures of school buses for this year. About 2/3 of our general ed bus routes were shut down through September at least, just because we didn't have the drivers. So we finally settled our transportation contract with our bus drivers, and it ended up being about a 25% increase to their wages just to get people to apply for those jobs. So we are fully staffed, or at least fully staffed for all our routes, not including our subs, but we're running all our routes now. We extended that same wage package to our contracted services provider, Reliant. So we told them to increase those wages also and pass the cost through to us. But we are seeing, quite a bit of an increase in just those labor costs, just to get people in the door to apply for them. And a lot of that stems from, after COVID hit, the transportation industry was considered high risk, and there was a lot of people paying a lot more for those jobs. So the private industry really raised their wages quite a bit faster. And we had like the tourist industry, once that started opening back up here, they started hiring all the CDL drivers and saying, okay, we'll give you a $10,000 bonus if you stay through the end of the tourist season through September. And there's just no way we could compete with that. So, and those folks know they have a job to come back, so they see all our vacancies. So they have no real incentive to not stay, get their $10,000 bonus and come back to us. So really, that's just kind of the business that we're in at this point, is just having to raise those wages to be able to get folks in the door. We have that same issue with our custodians. We just approved a contract on Tuesday. The school board passed that, which in aggregate, it's probably about a 10% raise in the first year, and it's spread, about 22 or 23% increase for the really low earnings on the pay scale, and then maybe 9% on the top end, just as to be able to retain the folks we have. So custodians, we're 40 or 50%, or several positions, 40, 50, I think, positions short on those. So having paying a lot of overtime to get schools clean, or having to, rotate folks around. Food service is going to be the same way. That contract's still in negotiations, but, their lowest wage earner right now is earning just over $13 an hour. Which I have a kid that works at Starbucks. He's getting about $17 an hour. So we're just not competitive. So we have to go through the bargaining cycle to get those wages raised. But, without additional money coming in, it makes it really difficult for us to keep the same student experience with far fewer people. So with this budget, we've been able to try to address that the best we can with our one-time money. Student attrition is primarily self-supporting at this point. We are seeking a little bit of an increase in federal, we're tracking a little bit of an increase in federal revenue as those number of meals sold increases, and the federal government has a program to actually increase the reimbursement rates too. So anticipating some reimbursement relief on that, and then a decrease in the number of lunch sales for just cash only type things. Our debt service fund, we're anticipating about a $1.3 million reduction in our tax request for that, just based on our current payment schedule. Our bonds have continued to go down since probably about 2008, but right now from 2013 to 22, it went down almost $100 million for the outstanding debt. We do have a bond package coming for the voters in April that has about $38 million on it for primarily school safety related things. So this is our property tax request, and this is the other thing that the city will be approving. Ours is a little bit confusing because we have to separate it between both fiscal years and calendar years. On a fiscal year basis, it's about 2.65% increase for all funds. And that grayed out section on the bottom really breaks that down into why those increases are, where those increases are going. So as you can see, that required local contribution, about $7.8 million is the biggest increase there. And then the additional local contribution, a little under $1 million, that's all the general fund money that makes up the little over $8 million that we're requesting. But really the point we want to drive home is that $7.8 million required local contribution doesn't get the school district any more money. It's just the state pays less. So that's kind of the narrative that we want to make sure everyone knows about, because we're going to get, kind of beat over the head saying your property taxes keep going up, but keep asking for money. So I should note the additional local contribution has actually decreased since 2017 by a little over $1 million. So we're getting less in that additional allowable, which is tied to our ADM, more or less. So as our ADM's gone down, or our enrollment, it's the additional locals tied to that, whereas the required local contribution is tied to property values. So I did find it interesting that as far as, the state says they recognize inflation when we're talking about when the city's paying. So the city goes up based on the inflationary cost of home prices here, but the other funding for the state does not recognize inflation so far. Hopefully SB 52 passes in its current form and we can get an inflationary adjustment, which really will allow us to do some more long-term fiscal and instructional planning based on a known factor of how many dollars we'll get in a year and being able to keep the resources that we have. That middle section is our calendar year request with our unfunded bond debt. So our 2022 calendar year request had about $20 million in unfunded bond debt from that the state cut out of their budget, so the taxpayers picked that up. So we had to pass that along. So our effective mill rate is going to go down by about 0.45, although again, the district's probably not going to see a whole lot of additional money from that. I will note that we don't have a current estimated assessed value in there, so we're just using what we had for the 2022 budget, and we'll get that updated. So that'll change the mill rates a little bit once we get those plugged in, but just for comparison purposes, once you strip out that unfunded bond debt, you will see an effective decrease in the mill rate for the district. Any questions on the tax request?
Yeah, Andy, so I want to make sure I understand you're talking about the local contribution going up and the state amount going down, and that's a result of the state contribution basically being tied to CPI and state being flat funded?
It's the required local contribution is based on the full value of the property in acreage. So it went up from, I think, around 42 billion to 45 billion from 21 to 22. So that big increase in those calendar years is really what's driving the 24 amount that the state takes away from our funding. So as those assessed values got redone as property value, I mean, it's kind of tied to CPI, but not really. It's more just tied to what the city assesses the value at. So as the city increased that assessment, which was necessary, so that the home price is going up, the unintended consequence of that increased assessment is the district's paying a higher percentage of the education funding. We know that, housing is a component of CPI, I believe. So as that tracks up, then we are going to pay more. And it is a dollar for dollar decrease in state revenue.
Oh, yeah. Al.
Yeah, on the other side of the coin, when can we see expectations for increasing student scores on math and reading and those things?
That's a good question. The difficult part is putting more kids in every classroom, and then having to make changes every year when we don't have known funding. So even if we got an increase in the BSA reset where our staffing was, and if we don't have any sort of inflationary component adjustment to that, we're going to be in the same spot the next year having to make changes to all those programs. So it becomes difficult to evaluate. We are hoping this, the Alaska Reads Act, which we're investing more in pre-K. We did add about 8 classrooms into our general fund for pre-K. So we are trying to really invest money in that, and then new reading curriculum to help get those test scores up. I'm probably not the greatest person to be describing the instructional changes and what those impacts might be, as tell you how much it costs, but really are trying to focus in on those kind of core math and reading scores now and getting the proficiency up.
Well, I think that's what employers, they look for. I was surprised the other day. I went to a place to buy some stuff and the gal counted me back change. And it was a shock. She actually counted me change. And so, for employers, they look for people that come out of high school and want to become a plumber or anything of that nature. That's one of the things I think that we overlook a lot.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, but that's one of the other initiatives we have is called this College Career Life Readiness, where we're engaging with business leaders in the community to try to get those career pathways for these kids set earlier on and have that defined, and figuring out what the employers need the students to come away with. So we have a group of folks, our superintendent, and I think it was Bill Pop and some of the other business leaders in town down in Nashville, because they put in a really robust program where they're choosing these career pathways. So they're down there kind of learning about that and how that can be emulated up here. And then we're working with that Choose Anchorage initiative to try to get on board with them to help really just identify what those needs are from employers and trying to get those folks ready to enter the workforce as soon as they're out of college or out of high school if they don't go to college.
And Anna,
Yeah, I guess I have I guess it's more of a comment than a question, just building on what you had said, Al. I mean, it seems like, well, I guess, and I do have a question actually. Yeah, the comment though is, it seems like employers would have an interest in funding our public school or not directly funding our public schools, because they're either paying for it through our public school system where kids can learn, while they're in K-12 and beyond, or they have to pay more in vacancies and training and trying to find qualified workers. So it seems like you pay either way. And so it does seem like there's an argument to be made here that this is a good economic investment.
And, oh, sorry, you had more.
Oh, well, then I had a question too, because I was also thinking, I know one of the big things that impacts students' ability to learn and even focus on things like homework is, are you getting food, in school or out of school? Are you stably housed or are you housing insecure? Are you having to move or are you worried about eviction? So I was wondering for the child in transition program, I know that has to do with folks experiencing homelessness and making sure that they don't have to move to a different school if they are evicted and just keeping them in their school of choice. And I wondered if you happen to know if those numbers have increased over the last couple of years, the kids who qualify for or are participating in that program.
I don't know offhand how many students we have in there, but I mean, that's definitely an issue that we see. We have a really high transiency rate at a lot of our schools. Some of them, it's up where they change over, 100% of the kids in a year. I mean, it's not the same kids. Some kids are there, a lot of the kids are there at the same time, but they have so many churning in and out, like they'll be there a couple of weeks and leave, new kids come in, a couple of weeks and leave. So that is a challenge. And that CIT program does work pretty well. It's expensive because it's mostly paying for cabs to get kids to school, gas cards, things like that. But we are working with the Chamber of Commerce to help really figure out what those needs are from the community so we can get a more robust pipeline just into that workforce. And the students can come away with the skills they need to enter.
How many students do we have?
Right now, we're at a little over 44,000.
Carolyn, did you have a question? Oh, sorry. One comment that I would make in response, Al, too, is that it's often said that there's really no connection between the amount of money that goes to school education and student achievements. Like that's a talking point you hear a lot. That happens to be inaccurate. There is really strong research that links the amount of funding you give to schools to student achievement. It doesn't happen immediately. It's a longer term type of thing, a multi-year thing. But generally better funded schools do produce better outcomes. And the reverse of that, letting schools go off of a deep cliff, is something that you would absolutely expect to see diminish student performance. So that, I mean, it's common sense, but it's also borne out by a lot of the data that's there, despite some popular talking points, I think.
Right. There's only been a few years that I've been in the district where we've had a known increase in funding the following year. It makes it really challenging when we're in that mode where, okay, we got to figure out what we're going to cut next. And even if we get funding by the end of the year, we've already done our budget. We've already disrupted our teachers, our staff, and the students because their teachers aren't focused on being in the same place next year. They're focused on at the last half of the year, focused on where they're going to have to go or even being pink slip depending on the year. So having a known increase and being able to project that out many years in the future, that's really what we need to see, that student achievement growth. And it doesn't have to be like some huge increases. I mean, we need a one-time reset, but we do need that inflationary adjustment, kind of like we have in the city tax cap, where we can add that inflation, that component in there to be able to help fund our education system and keep it at least the same number of bodies in those seats that we have going forward, instead of always having to retool our programs and reduce staff. And then potentially hire them back.
What has the school board done to reduce the out of classroom costs?
Well, I mean, for my department, since 2013, we've got about a third of our budget staff, a quarter of our accounting staff, and half of the CFO staff. So most of the departments within our areas have been reduced, with the exception, I think HR is about the only one that has really increased over the years, and 4 or 5 bodies or whatever, not substantial increases. But yeah, I mean, we don't have nearly as many people doing the work as we did 10 years ago. And we're getting down to the point where, like, my budget staff, I'm now the CFO, I don't know that, but we have a budget director and 3 budget staff to manage $850 million budget. So a lot of the preparation and for like these things is coming, we're doing a lot of the work ourselves and presenting it, and there's not a lot of duplication where other people are doing it, they're feeding it into us.
And is this,
Right.
is this your last slide, Andy, or? do you-
Yeah, I got a couple more.
Okay.
Not very many. The next slide, this is just a chart that we put together to show that required local contribution and the change since the last time the BSA was updated. The blue bar going up is what the city's been paying for that required local contribution, and the bar going down is the state's share. So zero sum game for ASD, whoever the state pays less, the local government pays more.
Can I ask on this slide, this is Anna, so. Cause I understand what you're saying with this zero sum game, and you mentioned, that housing costs were a big cause of the increase for the last year. Would you say that's been true over the last few years? Cause I know housing costs have been going up, or are there other factors that are contributing to that local increase?
No, the actual provision in statute, it's 2.65 mils of the full and true value of property taxes. So it takes into account, it really is just what that assessed valuation is. And then there's a difference between the assessed valuation that we see on here and what the actual assessed valuation is. And I think it's, 7 million maybe, but it has to do with what's allowable, or what the city for exemptions, for property tax exemptions versus what the state is mandated. Like they mandate some, I think, senior exemptions and veterans, I think are the two. But I think the city goes beyond what's required from the state. So the delta is generally that difference between what's required and what the city does on top of that. So occasionally you see a bill come through that says we're going to eliminate the senior exemption in statute, which would have a pretty big effect on how much the local districts pay. It doesn't really affect the state, other than they're paying less for education, and this number would go up considerably. But it is just based on that assessed valuation and not really anything else, not really home prices or anything. It's just how fast that is, the assessor catches up with it. There's a couple more slides. This one, it shows our state, or our cost by state function. This is how the state apportions it out for our reporting purposes. It's probably hard to see in this light, but there's 2 bars. There's one that's up at the top that's blue for district administration. That's the cost of the school board, superintendent, legal fees, auditing, and then chief executive salaries and cost there. And then the other blue bar is the district administration support, which is going to be our finance personnel, payroll, HR, purchasing, just kind of those ancillary costs of running a business. IT makes up most of that, actually. So really, those are the ones that aren't in school buildings. By and large, all of those other costs are actually in a school building. Big ones are operations and maintenance, instruction, and special ed. So really just kind of put this together to show where those functional costs are.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, because I know there's a lot of talk about teachers versus like you mentioned out of classroom. I was wondering, of all these categories, which ones are basically direct services to students? Because it looks like special education instruction will be direct service with things like support services, students, special support services, students. Are those all direct student working with students basically? As
Right,
opposed
so
to
instruction,
back
yeah.
end?
So it's instruction, special education instruction, that's the face-to-face, everyday, face-to-face in the classroom, teachers, assistants, supplies, materials, equipment that's used in that classroom every day. The support services for students, that's counselors, security guards, nurses. So those are people working with students every day, but not necessarily in front of them all the time. The only other one that kind of gets a little bit confusing as far as describing to folks is that support services for instruction. That includes our librarians, but it also includes professional development for teachers and then the supervision of principals. So we have folks in our office that, like our directors for special education, or not special education, but for elementary and secondary education, they're the one that are managing the principals of the schools. They're also included in that, as well as the professional development. So we have our teaching and learning department that's developing the curriculum. So that's all kind of embedded in that one. So that one's not quite as clear. Some of that's actually in the district office, but it also includes librarians, so.
Okay.
It's good.
Okay.
But the other ones are fairly, are almost all school-based.
Okay, because it does seem like it's confusing for folks when there's discussion about teachers versus everybody else, but then we hear things like, school counselors are providing really critical services because mental health and behavioral health is such an issue, so it seems worth characterizing it as direct services to students versus, truly administration costs.
Yeah, and almost all of those are directly in the school buildings, except for with the ones in the blue bars are not in there, and then the ones that I kind of described in that support services instruction, that's more the management of the direct management of schools. But about 85, if you scroll down a little bit, about 85% of our salary, or all our general fund costs are salaries and benefits. So as we talk about reductions, we don't have a whole lot of other levers to pull other than to reduce personnel. The other big chunk is utilities and building rents, and we can't, those fixed costs, it's kind of hard to get around. But, you know, like most of our other ones are kind of small dollars compared to what we spend on salaries and benefits. The last couple slides are just describing kind of those things that we discussed earlier with programmatic changes, increasing the pupil teacher ratio, closing out Abbott Loop permanently, and also Ursa Major. We did move mental health. We created a new department for mental health. After pandemic, we just saw kids coming back with more and more just severity in the behaviors, both like the number of occurrences and the intensity of behaviors are really been increasing. We really want to try to get more supports out to our schools to be able to provide those mental health services. Kind of stepping down some of our items that were funded through federal stimulus, like virtual again, summer school, and IT remote learning. So all the supports that go along with that, with Chromebooks and all the specific software that we had to buy to kind of stand those programs up. So trying to step that down. We did increase special education supports to accommodate the increased numbers of students with intensive needs. And we made some administrative and operational reductions with management of our virtual programs, gifted programs, things like that. So we did, and we cut out some positions that were vacant and we just couldn't hire, so we removed those from the budget. A few different changes in our revenue estimates. We did see an uptick in planning for a small uptick in enrollment. And then we can now receive pre-K funding through the Alaska Reads Act that pays for a 0.5 ADM for preschool students that are not paid for by other state or federal funding. So anything like if the city pays for a class through the municipal or preschool classes through the alcohol tax, we get to count those as a 0.5 ADM to help offset some of the cost of those classrooms and maybe stand up some new ones. So happy that went through. The SRO costs we were able to cut out of the budget. We didn't actually pay those this year, but they were in the budget as we were planning to pay them. The assembly said, we ended up revising the budget and taking care of that. And then the mayor and the staff took it out of the budget for the following year. So really thankful for that. That's about $2.3 million for us. And then we changed our estimate and our vacancy rates as, you know, the kind of unprecedented vacancies, just like the city is at this point. And a lot of those increases the special ed supports, you know, from a management thing, I'm not totally sure they're going to fill all those positions. So I increased our vacancy rates for that a little bit. But aside from that, that's the presentation. Opened up the questions. Do you have any?
Yeah, Carol.
It was mentioned earlier that 29 million is being used in fund balance for this coming year.
So a couple different different, not necessarily different pots of money, but the description of it. So about 29 million is used from what we saved through vacancies this year and prior years kind of leading up to this. And then, but our total fund balance is about 45 million that we're using. And that includes $16 million in one-time funds that we received this year from the state that we chose not to spend on this year and instead carry it forward to help offset next year's deficit.
Does that leave remaining?
So we'll be at the board minimum, which is 8% of our expenditures. Have it in front of me. So that'll leave about 48 or $50 million in fund balance, of which about 25 million of that is set aside for the bond debt, for the bond rating reserve. So we do keep that. So that leaves another, 20 or 25 million in truly unassigned fund balance. If our plan goes all the way through to the end of next fiscal year. So we'll still be, solvent, we'll still have a cushion there, but not as big as it has been. Typically, we've been about 10% of expenditures in previous, and that's been the state cap. However, that was lifted until 2025.
All things being relative, this is still kind of like a relatively safe place fund balance wise.
Yes,
If
yeah,
all things.
yeah. We'll have enough money. I mean, we won't have any cash flow issues or anything. Then barring any, really unforeseen circumstances, we will stay fiscally healthy.
But there would be a cliff set up for FY 25.
That's the whole thing is, we're spending $65 million in one-time money to support that with an increase in PTR. If you're tracking 3% inflation, that's can get you up to about 85 million for FY 25 as your true deficit without having any fund balance reserves to be able to apply towards that.
And for Brian, Rachel, Carmela, also any questions from any of you guys?
This is Carmela, none here. Thank you.
Thank you.
None for me, thank you.
This is Brian. I'm okay.
Thanks, guys. Fran, from anyone else in the room?
I guess just an observation, and maybe correct me if this is wrong. So that it seems like the long-term trend in the school budget is that we used to fund it better just because the formula and all of the other pieces were in place that was true. And then we used to have better outcomes. And then if outcomes are tied to some extent to funding, then the reduction of funding over time has also kind of eroded away at our outcomes, is what it seems like.
And the outcomes are harder to describe because the last few years with COVID, I mean,
Sure.
using a year of homeschool, that just wasn't really productive.
Yeah. But I guess it set us up in a way that we're less able to be resilient and to offset some of those other external factors.
Yeah, I mean, we've had similar issues going back even longer than that, where, we don't have that known funding. The last funding increase was, I think, done in 15, 16, and 17, which provided BSA increases. But when they wrote that bill, it also included one-time funds in each of those years. And then the legislature subsequently stripped out the one-time funds. So from 16 and 17, we were really tied to about $2015. We did see BSA increases, but it was kind of stepped down from they just removed the one-time fundings each year of that.
And I guess because what I'm hearing, just generally people observing that maybe in the, late 80s, 90s, 2000s, we had one of the best school districts, or people perceived that we had some of the best schools in the country. And so it seems like that was maybe the time that funding was more flush.
It's been hit and miss over the years, like they'll reset the formula, kind of these kind of sea change moments. If I kind of had my way with funding, one, it'd be inflation proofed. And two, we have some component for our the district cost factor. It's one thing we didn't really mention is the state has this district cost factor in the statute, which will give some more money based on cost of living in different districts. And Anchorage is set at the 1, meaning we're the cheapest. When it was done, the study was done like 1999 to 2003 or something. It's been over 20 years since the data started being pulled for that. So, and now it's gotten more expensive, quite a bit more expensive to live in Anchorage than it has in some of the surrounding communities. So ideally, you would have that inflationary component, then every 2 to 5 years reset that district cost factor for the cost of living. But that's really a hard one to get through the legislature, as it's, everybody but Anchorage eventually has something to lose there. So that one's harder to do.
So in our last meeting, we talked about the possibility, I think, of a resolution on the BSA from this body. And I don't know what the will of the group is as far as something like that, whether folks here are, in support of doing a resolution and what the resolution, might say.
Mr.
I-
Chair,
Yeah.
this is Carmela Warfield. Looking at the calendar, it looks like, unless I'm reading wrong, that we have 7 minutes to the top of the hour for the end of our meeting. And so I would, if I'm reading that right, I would respectfully request that we table this discussion to our next meeting to make sure we have time to give it proper deliberation for each committee member.
That is open for discussion. I know we are very short on time. I was hoping we would have a little more discussion space. What do others think? Because there is a timeliness factor if we're talking about taking a position on something during a legislative session where, this legislation is being moved on right now. Yeah,
I
Anna.
understand what you're saying, respectfully, Mr. Chair, but 6 minutes with a hard stop at 1 o'clock for a lot of us is just not proper time for us to take a position on a resolution or to debate the issue or to come to a consensus, in my opinion. So I would just respectfully request that we explore other options to make sure all committee members can be heard and thoughtfully participate in a potential resolution or not having a resolution. Thank you.
Anna has a comment.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think there isn't enough time to dig into the issue today. I think, this is really helpful information. I think the question would be if this group wants to contemplate, because I know there's also multiple legislative bills on the table, I think more than when we met last time. So another question would be, is it in response to one specific proposal or is it the general concept? And I don't have the answer there, but, yeah.
And just to add one more thing that maybe you guys would want to contemplate is your resolution to the assembly or is your resolution to the state? Is who are you? Because again, if we're sending generally this body is advisory to the assembly. And so if you're sending it to the assembly, are you requesting something on behalf of the BAC for the assembly to come up with their own resolution? Or are you just submitting your support for, say, ASD's budget that's in front of the assembly right now? What kind of resolution are we looking for to the assembly and or, something to the state, if that's what so maybe it would be a good thing to take the time between the now and the next meeting to decide, kind of come up with your opinions on what you're really thinking of is in your support of.
Well, and respectfully, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry I couldn't see the prior speaker who it was, but thanks for the comments and the contributions. I would just add to that the body would need to decide overall if we were proceeding with a resolution before we decided who the intended recipients and target recipients would be. And thank you all for your comments.
Yeah, absolutely. These are all things that would have to be discussed. I completely agree. And yeah, we are out of time now. So it will have to wait. Do we have, yes, Anna?
Oh, just a comment too. I know if our meeting is April 13th, I think there is still time only because I know the legislature does not have a habit of ending right at their 90-day mark. And so the budget is likely not to be settled, but it will be much later in the process. So just to throw that in there too.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. All right, well, we will have to, revisit the topic at our next meeting. We do have, of course, a space for audience participation. And I don't think we have any members of the public online or in person, so I think that's moot. And then, our next meeting is on April 13th. We do have, the ongoing topics of our department assignments, revisiting this BSA discussion, I think, and then the discussion of real property tax. Is that something that we should do in our next meeting or timing wise?
Yes, please. I would vote yes, please, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
In fact, we could table those. I think if that is the will of the body and the chair's decision, I think that tabling the topics and carrying them forward would be helpful, including our committee assignments and reports. The department assignments, I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Okay, then any other comments before we close out? Well, I'd hear a motion to adjourn then.
The Carmela Warfield motion to adjourn.
Right, moved. Is there a second?
Anna, I'll second.
All right, seconded by Anna.
Usually don't need these.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.